Welcome, Slayers of Giants, to Tilting at Windmills. We have a bit of an unusual episode today. It looks like I'm going to be moving back to the United States soon. Long story, and it's still not certain. Miracles could happen, so I don't want to get into the details just yet. Suffice it to say, I do not want to return. And this week, I want to talk about one of the reasons why. Our show is just Doug the producer and me this week, kind of a bit of a throwback there to when things started, but we do have a special guest, sort of. It's former President Barack Obama's tweet. So on Thursday, President Obama posted, "Violence has no place in America. Michelle and I are praying for the service member shot in Washington, D.C. today and send our love to their families as they enter this holiday season under the most tragic of circumstances." Remember what it was like to have a president who posted presidentially sounding things? That was nice. And so I am reluctant to disagree with someone I respect and admire, but I have to play editor here a bit because the first part of President Obama's statement is just incorrect. It's not a trivial error. It's a misunderstanding that has become the foundation of the center-right Democratic establishment's response to far-right fascism. And I know it's just a post on Bluesky, right? No. He had enough space in the constraints of the character limit to write, "Violence should have no place in America." That would have been an idealistic, radical message. But violence, unfortunately, not only has a place in America, but is the foundation of the United States as we know it. And this horrific incident in Washington, D.C. is emblematic of that violence and the way we misunderstand it. The shooting of 2 National Guardsmen and an immigrant from Afghanistan is certainly a terrible incidence of violence. But we need to examine it more holistically to understand that it's part of something larger. And as we zoom out, we'll see that a simple law enforcement response will never get us to a place of violence should have no place in America. In fact, it will lead to more violence. That's not speculation or prognostication. That's already the official government response. Those National Guardsmen were there because they were ordered to be there. All orders are an example of a kind of violence, often pretty benign, but a function of a hierarchy system, which is rooted in power differential and the threat of harm. Do this or else. Sure, an argument can be made that no military can function effectively without a rigid system of orders delivered and followed, but we can't gloss over that. Orders might be necessary to make a military work, but the work of a military is to wield violence, ostensibly in the pursuit of preserving peace, but with a dubious record of success. Is the United States achieving a more peaceful society because it has a highly regimented and effective military? Peaceful compared to whom? Costa Rica has no military. Proponents of militarism may argue the U.S. is partially responsible for the peace Costa Rica enjoys. Others who know more about Latin American history would certainly dispute that, but no one can reasonably debate the outcome. U.S. militarism has not made the United States more peaceful than Costa Rica. And those guardsmen were there because a fascist regime wanted a show of force on the streets of American cities. If we include intimidation as a form of violence, their presence was violent. The justification for the deployment was so egregiously false that a court has already ruled it's illegal. But the regime appealed, because the appeal extends the deployment, preserving the real consequence of the action, which is to send a chilling message to local residents, and to get images on TV to prop up the regime's image as enforcers of the law. Note, they are violating the law to look like they care about the law. Putting heavily armed soldiers on peaceful street corners in tourist areas for show is itself an act of violence towards the people intimidated by the publicity stunt. We don't know the shooter's motives yet. The latest I've heard is that he's an immigrant from Afghanistan. Without knowing his motives, it's irresponsible to speculate about the kind of result he desired to achieve from his act of violence. But we do know that the regime's immediate response has been to halt all immigration from Afghanistan. So if an individual there, say a translator who worked with the United States Army when we invaded that country, is currently trying to escape the wrath of the government we put in place, Trump himself negotiated the terms of their ascendancy to power in Afghanistan at the end of his first term, that translator is now trapped in Afghanistan. That guilt by association reaction is a kind of violence. And while the regime may be focusing its first reaction onto one country, its rhetoric has so primed its red hats to fear and despise all immigrants, except white wealthy ones from South Africa apparently, that this latest violence will surely inflame anti-immigrant sentiment and lead to more anti-immigrant violence. And these things layer onto one another and metastasize. Part of the way fascism works is that they get you involved. You hear the both sidesism and the calls to not be partisan, and so you say to yourself, oh, I'm not a liberal or a conservative, and then your brain goes casting for specific issues where you agree with one side or the other. And if they can trick you into saying, sure, I want socialized medicine, but I don't like trans women in women's bathrooms, or sure, I want public schools, but I don't like investing my tax dollars in teaching the children of illegal immigrants, then they have got you on the hook for the kind of violence you might participate in. And maybe it will be only this kind of casual, unexamined verbal violence. But if it translates into the way you vote, or the kind of leaders you cheer for, or the ones you give a pass when they're advocating for genital checks, or putting people in concentration camps and deporting them to God knows where, you're now part of the violence. And once you're part of it, it becomes difficult to say, I was wrong. See, now it's part of your identity, and people feel threatened, especially in a society where doubling down is seen as strength rather than weakness. But we need to get to a place where we can say, I was wrong. Our guest, Barack Obama, famously evolved on the issue of gay marriage, and maybe that kind of language gives professional politicians a permission structure to evolve their way out of supporting white nationalism or sexism or transphobia or whatever. But only if enough voters do more than evolve. We need to be loud and clear about our errors, so that the more cowardly professional politicians feel comfortable evolving. To demonstrate, I once wrote a blog post in defense of our guest Barack Obama's drone strike policy. My rationale at the time was that it was better to have drones making targeted strikes than to have full-on, boots-on-the-ground invasions, because we know even the most disciplined military forces end up doing things like raping civilians. But I was wrong. Appeasing hawks who are calling for war with half war does not satisfy them. Drones make murder so impersonal that soldiers end up killing lots of non-combatants. The civilian population ends up living in constant fear of death from above, so they're not persuaded that the invading force of robots is targeting legitimate military targets but cares about their safety. And the psychological effect of airmen who go to a facility in safety in Colorado, kill people from the other side of the world, and then go home to have dinner with their families can understandably lead to madness. So, Mr. President, I get why you chose that option, but I'm evolving away from lesser of two evils arguments. If American imperialism at the end of a barrel of a gun is wrong, American imperialism by robot is also wrong. And the allure of not having to have a clear exit strategy because you can just fly the drones home is a false one. Causing that kind of terror to civilian populations has generational effects. You blew up some people you hated and made a whole generation of people who fear and hate you. That's not a victory or even a quiet exit strategy. It's a failure you're hoping won't come back to haunt you until it's some future administration's problem. Which brings us back to our present. Again, we don't know the DC shooter's motives, and we may never know, but based on the information we do have, he was someone from Afghanistan who may have worked for the CIA, and even if that is possibly correct, then we have to acknowledge that this is one of those long-term consequences of American imperialism. And it predates the current regime. Trump just put very easy targets around DC. And to be clear, I am not both sidesing here. This regime's actions, like cutting U.S. aid and starving millions of people, pushing for the complete eradication of Palestinians to make Palestine into a new beachfront property for the ultra-wealthy, and the abject capitulation to Putin so he can annex Ukraine, those are going to lead to a lot more violence than what would have come about under a Harris administration. But that lesser of two evils cannot hide the fact that U.S. foreign policy and U.S. domestic culture are incredibly violent, replete with violence, violent in their nature. I have been to Cambodia and Vietnam. I have been to apartheid Israel and seen the fields of American-bought mines, the walls covered in U.S.-bought razor wire, the IDF soldiers paid with U.S. dollars carrying American M16s. And back home, I've held a Black Lives Matter sign while people holding AR-15s shouted at me. The United States is incredibly violent. My son just visited me here in Barcelona. We had a wonderful visit, seeing all the sights we could pack into a week. And while we were wandering through El Gòtic to the Lisieux station to catch the L3 up to Parc Güell, I was telling him about messages I'd received from back home, asking if I was safe here, and linking to an article about some anti-tourist street protests last summer, where protesters shot tourists with water pistols on La Rambla. Water pistols. And these friends who sent me this article aren't stupid. They know the difference between a gun that shoots bullets and a water gun. But they're so immersed in U.S. culture that they translate sentiment into a kind of American potential violence. Now, I have to acknowledge that, as a white, cishet, middle-aged man, I've not had the same life experience as every other immigrant here in Spain. I've seen videos of Muslim women being confronted by right-wingers who shout at them for wearing the hijab and not yet speaking Spanish. And that's awful, and it's a kind of violence. And that spite may turn into votes, and those votes may turn into anti-immigrant policies, which employ the power of the state to oppress immigrants. That's certainly a kind of violence, and it's violence that leads to more violence. But it's not the same as when you don't know if the person saying you're in Spain speaks Spanish may or may not be carrying a gun, and wasn't raised on a media diet of movies and TV shows and talking heads on the news who all seem to agree that good guys kill people and bad guys kill people, and the only difference is that good guys kill the right people and bad guys kill the wrong people. Because if that's the culture, and someone is shouting at you, they're letting you know they think you're the wrong kind of person. And while that might be hurtful, in the American moral framework, it may also mean they will believe they are doing the right thing if they kill you. So when I say violence should have no place in America, I'm talking about a revolution in American culture. It's not just getting rid of the guns, though that's a good practical step. It's getting rid of the notion that shooting people solves problems. It's eradicating the belief that hitting children is the way to teach them proper behavior. And frankly, I don't see it changing anytime soon. And I don't want to pay for state-sponsored violence every time I pay taxes. Support the fascist regime in power just by being a citizen under its thrall. But it seems like I will not be allowed to remain here in Spain. I had this principal I worked for many years ago, a pretty terrible human being who would shout at teachers until they cried. Not a good person. But he shared something from one educational leadership book, one of those he was always reading in his office where he was hiding. And it stuck with me because it's spot on. He said, working in public education is about enduring the amount of hypocrisy you can bear. And that's absolutely true in public ed, a system which is racist and sexist and capitalist and oppressive at its root, where almost everyone involved is trying the best they can to empower and improve the lives of children while also indoctrinating them into a system that will keep them down for life. Stay in line, don't speak until you're called on. Grades get you into college and the right job and a house with a white picket fence to contain your yellow dog and your 2.5 kids until you get sick and get fired and have no insurance and you're on the streets because you must have done something to deserve it because your teachers told you that if you just did everything right, this wouldn't happen to you. I've come to believe that living in the United States is analogous to working in public education. We pay our taxes and abide by our laws and try not to get too political in the hopes that we can live in the wealthiest country with the most powerful military and feel some trickle-down wealth and safety within the amount of hypocrisy we can bear. It doesn't have to be this way. Every single law, every system exists because all the politicians only have their jobs because they're elected by the people. And yes, gerrymandering and the Electoral College mean a minority of the public can dictate those laws and systems, but the majority, not some 49-51 split, but an overwhelming majority, either vote for this status quo or don't care enough to vote against it, because it is our way of being, and turning that on its head is too scary. And it looks like I have to go back to that. I don't plan on writing a book-length letter to a personified America explaining why I'm coming back. I did that. And for that matter, I don't plan on writing another book of poetry processing why I'll be single again. Did that. Instead, I'm going to continue to focus on writing this big old fantasy novel I'm working on, and then more sci-fi and fantasy and who knows what else, maybe romance or horror, but fiction. Because I want to be part, yes, a small part, probably an insignificant part, but a tiny part of the pantheon of voices who say, it doesn't have to be this way. So, President Obama, you're wrong when you say violence has no place in America. The country has been rooted in violence and oppression since its inception, and that's only getting worse under a fascist regime. But America could choose to become a different kind of place. Hell, the whole world could choose to be a place where no one has to flee across one set of imaginary lines to get to safety or be forced back across those imaginary lines. It doesn't have to be this way. Last week, I hope you all got to spend time with family or found family and think about what you're thankful for. That's a valuable practice. And now I want to encourage you all to spend some time, more than a Thursday, privately contemplating or discussing with loved ones the kind of world you want to live in and how to make that a reality for all the human beings on the planet. Let that be the way you move into 2026, and let it be your pastime as we weather whatever 2026 will bring. Let's tell ourselves and each other stories that illuminate the way it is and plot a path to the way it could be. After all, we are going to arrive somewhere different. This reality is blessedly unsustainable. So let's talk about the reality we would prefer. Oh, and if you want to do something to that end in a more public way, consider joining us for the Anti-Fascist Write-a-thon on January 3rd. Register now, we'll all get together via Zoom, work on our current works in progress, and then take breaks together to commiserate with our fellow anti-fascist authors. I'll put a link to the registration page in the show notes. In the meantime, please stay safe and try to protect your neighbors.